The letter he never wanted me to read. There are moments in this job that stay with you long after the cameras go dark, long after the courtroom empties and the files get put away and the building goes quiet. This was one of those moments. A woman sat in front of me, 68 years old, retired nurse, hands folded in her lap the way people fold their hands when they're trying very hard not to fall apart. Her name was Linda, and the man sitting across from her, the one who had dragged her into my courtroom with accusations of theft and betrayal, was her son, her only son. The son she had raised alone after his father got sick. The son she had worked double shifts for. The son whose college tuition she had paid with her own worn-out hands. And now he was suing her for $20,000. I have seen a lot of things in 30 years on this bench, but I want to tell you something honestly. That morning, looking at that woman's face, I felt something I don't often let myself feel in a courtroom. I felt grief, not for the case, for the distance between two people who used to love each other and had somehow ended up here, on opposite sides of a table, with lawyers between them and cameras watching. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that a mother's love deserves more than a lawsuit, then subscribe, because I sit down every week and I tell you the truth about what I've seen. No politics, no performance, just the cases that changed me. Now let me take you back to where this one began. Linda Thompson had been a nurse for 31 years. Not the kind of nurse who punches a clock and goes home numb. The kind who remembers her patients' names. The kind who sits beside a frightened elderly man at 2 a.m. because he asked her not to leave, and she didn't. She had built her whole life around care, around showing up, around staying. Her husband Robert had been the same way, quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and never raised his voice. They had been married 41 years when the diagnosis came. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The word terminal changes a household. It changes the air inside a home. Linda told me later that the first thing she did after the doctor left the room was reach for Robert's hand. Not to cry, just to hold it, because that's who she was. What followed were 18 months of hospital visits, specialist appointments, medications that cost more per bottle than their monthly grocery bill. Insurance covered some of it, not enough, never enough. Linda sold her jewelry. She cashed a small pension she'd been building for 20 years. She drew from the joint savings account she and Robert had kept together since the early years of their marriage. Every withdrawal had a purpose: hospital copays, ambulance fees, the hospice care that let Robert spend his final weeks at home, in his own bed, with sunlight coming through the window he'd always loved. She did not take a single dollar for herself. When Robert passed, Linda buried him with dignity, a simple service, his favorite hymns, a headstone that said, "Beloved husband and father." She paid for all of it out of what remained. Then she went home, sat in his chair, and cried for 3 days. By the time Derek showed up, she had barely started to grieve. He arrived on a Saturday morning, 9 days after the funeral, not to check on her, not to bring food or sit beside her or ask how she was sleeping. He came with bank statements. Linda described it to me in a voice so steady it broke my heart. She said he walked in without knocking, the way children do when they still feel like a house belongs to them. He put the papers on the kitchen table. He didn't hug her. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He just pointed at the numbers and said, "You drained everything. That money was supposed to come to me." She tried to explain. She told him about the bills. She told him about the medications, the hospice, the burial costs. She showed him receipts she had kept in an old shoebox because she was the kind of woman who kept receipts. He didn't look at them. "Dad would have wanted me to have that money," he said. "You had no right." Linda told me she didn't argue. She said she just sat down slowly and looked at her son and tried to find the little boy she had raised somewhere behind his eyes. She couldn't find him. What she didn't know yet was that Derek had already called a lawyer, that the lawsuit had been filed before he ever walked through her door, that the conversation in the kitchen wasn't a confrontation, it was a performance. He had already decided what he believed, and no amount of receipts was going to change it, because this was never really about the money. Derek had struggled since college, jobs that didn't last, relationships that fell apart, a pattern of reaching for the next thing and blaming the last thing when it didn't work out. For years, Linda had quietly filled the gaps, paid rent when he couldn't, sent money without conditions, never once said, "I told you so." But kindness, when it goes unacknowledged long enough, stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like an insult. It starts to say, "You can't do this yourself." And some people, rather than face that truth, decide to resent the one who helped them. Robert's death had changed the math in Derek's mind. There was supposed to be something left. There was supposed to be an inheritance, a ladder out of his own failures. And when he found the accounts nearly empty, he didn't ask why. He decided who to blame. The morning of the case, I read the file before anyone arrived. That's my habit. I like to know the shape of a story before I hear it told. I look for inconsistencies, for dates that don't match, for signatures that feel off. In 30 years, you develop an instinct for these things. Derek's paperwork had something wrong in it. I spotted it before he even sat down. The date on one of his key documents, the one he claimed proved unauthorized withdrawals, was stamped 2 weeks before Robert died, before any inheritance could legally exist, before there was anything for Linda to steal. Either Derek hadn't looked closely at his own evidence, or he was betting that I wouldn't. He was wrong on both counts. When he walked in that morning, he wore a suit that looked freshly pressed. He sat down with the ease of someone who expected to win. He arranged his folder on the table the way people do when they want you to notice they brought documentation. He smiled at the camera. Linda came in quietly, gray cardigan, small pearl earrings. She sat down and folded her hands and looked straight ahead, and I could see in her face that she had been up most of the night. I opened simply. "Mr. Thompson, you're suing your mother for $20,000, claiming she stole your inheritance after your father's death. That's a serious accusation. I hope you have more than paperwork to back it up." He smiled confidently. "I have everything, Your Honor. Every withdrawal, every transaction. It's all documented right here." "We'll see," I said. And I meant it. He spoke for several minutes. His voice was polished, his argument rehearsed. He used words like misappropriation and unauthorized access that told me he had practiced with his lawyer. Every few sentences, he glanced at the camera. He was performing, and he was good at it. But performing and telling the truth are not the same thing. When Linda spoke, she didn't perform. She simply told me what happened. She described the hospital visits in the kind of detail that only comes from living them. She named the medications. She remembered the dates. She explained each withdrawal with the quiet precision of someone who had held those receipts in her hands and wept over them. Her voice broke once, just once. "I used that money to keep his father alive," she said softly, "and to bury him with respect. That's all I did. My son knows that." She didn't look at Derek when she said it. Derek looked away. I watched that exchange carefully. In that half second, I saw something cross his face. It wasn't anger. It was something older and harder to name. Something that looked almost like shame, quickly buried. I set down my pen. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "I'm looking at this document you've submitted as your primary evidence. The date on this withdrawal form is 2 weeks before your father passed. Can you explain that?" He blinked. The dates might be what?" I asked quietly. "There may have been a clerical error." "A clerical error," I repeated. The courtroom stirred. "And this signature here," I continued, holding up the page, "this doesn't match your father's signature on any other document in this file. It doesn't match your mother's either. So I'm going to ask you one more time, Mr. Thompson, who filled this out?" He opened his mouth, closed it. His confidence was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something was shifting. I could see it, the audience could see it. And I think somewhere very deep down, Linda could feel it too. I want to pause here for a moment, because what happened next is the part that changed the case. Not just legally, but humanly. I had received something that morning before the session began. It had come through the probate clerk's office, flagged as relevant to the case. A sealed envelope from Robert Thompson's estate file. I had read it privately before coming to the bench. When I reached for that envelope and held it up, I watched Derek's face very carefully, and I saw something I will never forget. He knew what was in it. "Mr. Thompson," I said slowly, "before your father died, he wrote a letter. It was filed with his estate documents and sealed. It's addressed to your mother. She has never seen it." Linda's hand went to her chest. Derek's jaw tightened. He looked down at the table. I broke the seal carefully, unfolded the paper, and read. Robert's handwriting was small and slightly uneven, the kind that comes from a man whose hands had grown weak near the end. But the words were clear. He wrote that if anything happened to him, he trusted Linda completely to use whatever remained in their joint accounts for bills, for burial, for her own needs going forward. He wrote that Derek had a life insurance policy through his employer and would be taken care of. He wrote that his only wish was that Linda would never have to struggle. And then, at the bottom, in letters that was slightly larger, as though he had pressed harder to make sure they would last, he wrote, "She gave everything. Please, son, don't make her fight for what she already earned." The courtroom went silent. Not the polite quiet of people being respectful. The deep, breathless silence of people who have just heard something true. Linda covered her mouth with both hands. Her shoulders trembled. She had never seen those words before. Her husband had written them for her, knowing he might not have the chance to say them out loud. And they had been sitting in an envelope in a clerk's office for 9 months, while her son took her to court. I folded the letter gently and set it down. I looked at Derek. "Your father knew," I said quietly. "He knew exactly what your mother had done and why. He trusted her completely. And you knew this letter existed, didn't you?" Derek didn't answer. "You knew," I said again, not as a question this time. He stared at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. He wasn't performing anymore. There was nothing left to perform. I have been a judge for a long time. I have sat across from people who have done far worse things than Derek Thompson did that day. I have looked at genuine criminals and felt something cold and clear. This was different. What I felt looking at Derek in that moment was not contempt. It was something heavier, a kind of sorrow for what greed does to a person when they let it go unchecked, for what resentment builds when someone stops being grateful and starts keeping score. He had not become cruel overnight. That kind of coldness grows slowly, quietly, in the dark. It feeds on old wounds and missed expectations and the convenient lie that someone else is responsible for your unhappiness. But none of that changes what he had done. He had taken his mother's grief and her sacrifice and her love, and he had turned them into accusations. He had put her in a courtroom and forced her to defend herself for keeping his father alive. I took a breath. "Mr. Thompson," I began, my voice steady, "this court has reviewed your claims, your documents, your father's estate records, and now his final letter. Here is my ruling. Your case is dismissed. With prejudice. That means you cannot bring this claim again." A ripple moved through the audience. "Your mother did not steal from you. She spent money that was legally hers, for purposes your father explicitly approved of and documented. Every dollar she spent was for his care or his burial. The accounts were joint accounts. She had every legal right to those funds." Derek's head dropped slowly. "Furthermore, you are ordered to pay your mother's legal costs, not as punishment, as accountability, because words have consequences and accusations have costs, and you brought this woman here without cause." I paused. "But I want to say something beyond the legal ruling," I continued. Because this courtroom isn't just about law, it's about truth. And the truth is this. Your mother sat by your father's bed. She held his hand through every treatment. She sold her jewelry to keep him comfortable. She planned his funeral when she could barely stand up from grief. And 9 days after she buried the man she loved for 41 years, her son came to her kitchen with bank statements. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You didn't come to check on her. You came to collect. The room was absolutely still. I hope one day you understand what that cost her. Not in dollars, in something you cannot get back. After the gavel came down, the audience sat quietly for a long moment before anyone moved. Linda didn't leap up. She didn't cheer. She sat with her eyes closed for a few seconds, as though she was talking to someone the rest of us couldn't hear. Robert, maybe. Telling him it was over. Telling him she was all right. Then she stood up slowly, straightened her cardigan, and picked up her small purse. She walked toward the exit, and then she stopped. She turned and looked at her son. Derek still had his head down. His suit that had looked so pressed and confident that morning now seemed to hang on him differently, like something borrowed that never quite fit. Linda looked at him for a long moment, and in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "I love you. I always will. But you need to figure out who you want to be." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out. Derek didn't move for almost a full minute after she left. He just sat there, staring at the table where his father's letter still rested. I don't know what he was thinking, but I know what I saw on his face. It wasn't anger anymore. It was the look of a man beginning to understand the weight of what he had done. That look doesn't always lead somewhere good. Sometimes people carry shame and let it harden into more resentment. But sometimes, just sometimes, it cracks something open. Sometimes it's the beginning of a long, quiet road back. I hope for his sake it was the second one. The episode aired 6 weeks later. By the following morning, the clip had been viewed over 14 million times. Not because of the verdict, because of the letter. People shared it with captions like, "I called my mom after watching this." Comment sections filled with people writing about their own mothers. Women who had worked 2 jobs and never complained. Women who had gone without new clothes for years so their children could have what they needed. Women who had loved without limits and sometimes been repaid with indifference. Linda became, without meaning to, a symbol, not of victimhood, of dignity. Because even at her lowest point, even after being dragged into a courtroom by her own child, she had not become bitter. She had not used the opportunity to humiliate him. She had said, "I love you," and walked out with her head held straight. That's not weakness. That is the hardest kind of strength there is. Letters came to the production office for weeks. Handwritten letters, which almost never happens anymore. A woman from Tennessee wrote that she had been estranged from her daughter for 6 years, and watching Linda made her finally send the first letter. A retired teacher from Michigan wrote that he had been holding a grudge against his mother for something that happened in 1987, and he didn't anymore. One note simply said, "Thank you for reminding us what forgiveness actually looks like." I kept that one. Robert's letter was framed and given to Linda by the clerk's office after the case closed. She told me she hung it in her bedroom beside a photograph of her and Robert from the early years of their marriage. Young, laughing, unaware of everything that was still ahead of them. She said she talks to him sometimes before she goes to sleep. She said she thinks he knew what Derek needed to hear, even then. That the letter wasn't just for her. It was for her son, too. A father's last attempt to remind his boy what mattered. Whether Derek ever truly heard it, I can't say for certain, but I was told months later that he had shown up at Linda's door. No lawyer, no papers, just him, standing on the porch where he had grown up, holding a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. She let him in. That's the kind of woman she was. I want to leave you with something I've been thinking about since that morning. We live in a world that measures everything: money, followers, square footage, salary. We've gotten very good at counting what we have and very bad at recognizing what we've been given. A mother's love doesn't appear on a balance sheet. You can't deposit it or withdraw it or present it as evidence in a folder with numbered tabs. But it is the most real thing most of us will ever receive in our lives. Linda Thompson spent 41 years loving her husband and 35 years loving her son. She gave without keeping score. She stayed without being asked to. She sacrificed without calling it sacrifice, because that's what love does when it's genuine. It just shows up. The law could give her back money. It could dismiss a case and order fees paid and stamp a document and declare her innocent. But it could not give her back the morning her son walked into her kitchen 9 days after her husband's funeral and put bank statements on the table. Some things the law cannot fix. What it can do, what I hope it did that day, is remind people that actions have weight, that cruelty is not neutral, that when you take someone's sacrifice and call it theft, you don't just hurt them, you diminish yourself. Derek Thompson sat in my courtroom, and for a little while he forgot who his mother was. He forgot what her hands had done. He forgot what love looks like when it's quiet and consistent and unglamorous and real. I hope the letter reminded him. I hope this story reminds you. Call the people you love. Not tomorrow, today. Tell them you see what they've done for you. Tell them it wasn't invisible. Tell them you know. Because one day you'll be sitting in a quiet room with their handwriting in your hands, reading the things they never got to say out loud. And you'll wish you had said thank you while there was still time. Take care of each other.